So we are reading the book of Leviticus, the book of Vayikra, a book that focuses on sacrifices. In a masterful essay entitled Violence and the Sacred, the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks presents a medieval explanation of the biblical logic behind sacrifices by Rabbi Joseph Albo, a Jewish philosopher active in Christian Spain in the first half of the 15th century. To understand it, let's first read a passage from Genesis. The passage from Genesis reads as follows: "The flood is over, Noah offers sacrifices, and God says in his heart, 'Never again will I curse the ground because of human beings, even though every inclination of their hearts is evil from childhood.' Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, 'Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything.'" This is from where we learn that the eating of animals, which was forbidden or certainly not permitted in the Garden of Eden, now becomes permitted for human beings. And then the Torah says, "Whoever sheds the blood of a person by people shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God, God has made people." So you have a strange progression of ideas. People are evil from their youth. Then God gives permission for human beings to kill animals. And then the requirement of seemingly, although the rabbis did not implement it, the requirement of capital punishment when someone takes the life of someone else. Sacks writes that according to Rabbi Albo, the logic of the passage is as follows. Noah offers an animal sacrifice after the flood. He's just brought a sacrifice in thanksgiving for having survived the flood. And when Noah brings an animal sacrifice, God sees that human beings need to express themselves this way. They are genetically predisposed to violence. That's what's meant by the phrase, "Every inclination of their hearts is evil from their youth." If society is to survive, then human beings, according to Albo, reasons God in this moment, human beings would need to be able to direct their violence towards non-human beings, whether as food or through sacrificial offerings. It is not, writes Sacks, that God approves of killing animals, but for now the least bad solution is to let people kill animals rather than murder their fellow human beings. Animal sacrifices, according to this thinking, are a concession to human nature. Sacrifices are a substitute for violence directed against human beings. Sacks then brings the thought of a French-American thinker, René Girard, who argues that, quote, "The purpose of sacrifices is to suppress internal violence in a society, to restore harmony to the community, to reinforce the social fabric." And Sacks then describes how the worst form of violence in a society is vengeance, which was part of the ancient Near East. If somebody killed you, and by the way, it's part of some parts of the Middle East now as well, that if someone kills you or kills a member of your family, then what you have to do is get vengeance and you need to kill them as well. And we know this in the Jewish tradition. Hillel sees in Pirkei Avot, some of us are studying Pirkei Avot right now in chapter 2, Mishnah 7, Hillel sees a human skull floating on the water, and he remarks, "Because you drowned others, they drowned you. And those who drowned you will in the end be drowned." And so it continues and continues. And Girard then argues you have to see if you agree with this or not, that we moderns have been saved from the cycle of vengeance. Why? Quote, for us, the circle has been broken. We owe our good fortune to one of our social institutions, above all, our judicial system, which serves to deflect the menace of vengeance. The system does not suppress vengeance, rather it effectively limits itself to a single act of reprisal enacted by a sovereign authority specializing in this particular function. The decisions of the judiciary are invariably presented as the final word on vengeance. Which is why it is so incredibly dangerous for our society when the justice system fails. When the judiciary, the decisions of the judiciary are not seen or recognized as the final word on vengeance. As Jews, we know what it is like to live in a world where the justice system fails us. From 1881 to 1884, in just the Russian Empire, according to historians, there were more than 200 pogroms. And a pogrom is not a riot of a random nature. It was an attack that took place with the implicit or explicit sanction from the very people charged with your protection. In his case study of the 1905 Odessa pogrom, in which 800 Jews were killed and more than 2,000 Jews were injured. Professor Robert Weinberg writes, quote, eyewitnesses reported seeing policemen directing pogromists to Jewish-owned stores and Jewish-owned apartments while steering the rioters away from the property of non-Jews. According to one contemporaneous report, police more than any other group in Odessa were responsible for the deaths and the pillage. The lurid details of the pogrom can be found in several eyewitness and secondary accounts, although the list of atrocities perpetrated against the Jews, writes Weinberg, is too long to recount here. Suffice it to say that the pogromists brutally and indiscriminately beat, mutilated, and murdered defenseless Jewish men, women, and children. They hurled Jews out of windows, raped and cut open the stomachs of pregnant women, slaughtered infants in front of their parents. In one particularly gruesome incident, pogromists hung a woman upside down by her legs and arranged the bodies of her 6 dead children on the floor below. These pogroms explain why between 1881 and 1914, nearly 2.5 million Russian Jews fled the Russian Empire. Many, perhaps even most, coming to the United States. And many, perhaps even most, were the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the great-great-parents of us, of we who are sitting here today. The Torah teaches in this week's Parsha, Lo ta'asu avel b'mishpat, don't commit corruption, avel, don't commit a sin, b'mishpat, when it's having to deal with matters of justice, recognizing that it's possible. What our own history and Rabbi Sachs and Rene Girard's understanding of the sacrifices and human nature and violence teach us is that the validity of the justice system, the perception that judges and courts and officers and police are fair, is the very basis of the fabric of our society. It is the thin border between order and chaos, between peace and war. As Sachs writes in his essay, justice is God's greatest desire. A world governed by justice, the only effective antidote to violence, is the rule of law. Some of you may know, many of you do not, that I will soon be an official chaplain of the Durham Police Department. My role will be to be a pastoral resource for officers, especially Jewish officers, of which there are a few, one of whom I am proud studied with me for conversion and is a member of Bethel Synagogue. To be a pastoral resource for officers, Jewish officers, and to provide support if any law enforcement incidents take place with Jewish families or the local Jewish community. I have incredible gratitude for police officers for the ways that they risk themselves day in and day out by walking into incredibly difficult situations, for the commitment to the rule of law and the public good, for their dedication to something larger than themselves. And I believe that the vast majority of police officers are good people. And my friends, our nation needs serious police reform. The rule of law must be fair, and it has to be perceived as fair if American society is to cohere. Too many African Americans, too many Black women and men, teenagers and children are being killed too often at the hands of police. Too many Black parents need to have a conversation with their children that white parents don't have to have, in the same way, teaching their children how to behave if they are pulled over by the police, and then sending their children off into the world hoping and praying that their child will come home safe. The verdict this week, convicting Officer Chauvin of the murder of George Floyd, has to be a beginning. We must not do avel b'mishpat. We have to stop seeing Black people as an inherent threat to be feared and violently subdued. We have to invest more and not less in the training of police officers so they are best prepared when they jump into the breach on our behalf. Most Russian Jews went to Europe and America at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Some went to Israel. I'll never forget from my trip a few years ago what one Black minister said when we were sitting around the table at Shabbat dinner after a week of being in Israel together, that a part of her, after seeing Israel with us, felt jealous She said, because Wakanda is not real. She said this because she saw how there in Israel, Jews had made a home. It's not a perfect home, but it's one where the police are Jewish. And when we call, we can depend on help. But African Americans have to try to make a home in this place that enslaved them. And where hundreds of years later, they don't feel safe when the police come, where they don't feel safe in their apartments, where they don't feel safe at a traffic stop for an expired registration, an issue that is an issue for many drivers in the middle of a pandemic that too often turns deadly. In that moment in Israel, when I heard her words and when I sat around the table with my Black brothers and sisters, I rededicated myself to making America be a home as it is for white Americans and as it has been for the Jewish people. A home, a society where all Americans need not fear to go to the police, but can trust in the rule of law. We have a long, long way to go. I hope that the verdict this week is a beginning to a long process still waiting to unfold. Shabbat Shalom.